Welcome to the Building Web3 podcast. I have my good friend Anurag. He is the co-founder of Avail. Anurag, before we get too deep into Avail, give us a brief background into yourself and what led you to co-found this project.
So I entered the crypto space back in 2017. Before that, I spent about 11 years in various product and engineering roles in fintech, regulatory tech, that sort of domain. 2017, I founded Polygon, built a lot of the stack that you see today at Polygon, including the Polygon POS chain, the Plasma chain, the bridging infra. I acquired three companies, Hermes, Zero, Maiden, and also started Avail within Polygon back in 2020. And up until last year, I was part of Polygon, but then we spun Avail out of Polygon into its own separate entity in general, and I left all operational roles at Polygon, and we've been running. Me and my fellow co-founder Prabal, who was head of research at Polygon, like both of us left to kind of run Avail independently. So that's the gist.
And most people will be familiar with Polygon, but for people that are unfamiliar, tell them a little bit about what is Avail and what's your guys' mission there?
Yeah, so I see essentially the thing is that if you kind of look at blockchains from a progression in terms of how blockchains have been built. So of course 2009 was the first blockchain Bitcoin that came into existence, but 2014 is when the first general purpose blockchain Ethereum came. And after that, we've seen a lot of layer one blockchains emerge, most of which are attempts at doing better versions of Ethereum. So you can think of like Binance Smart Chain or Phantom or Solana or Aptos or Sui. I mean, name it in general. And so this is essentially the first generation of blockchains, or I would say monolithic sort of blockchains, in the sense that all the functions of a blockchain are encapsulated into one layer, or one network in general. In around 2020, a lot of us realized that was not the way to go, in the sense that even if you make the fastest, most scalable sort of layer one blockchain, it wouldn't fit in all the world's transactions on one network. I mean, very similar to how, let's say, apps on the internet, for example, they are not hosted on one single big supercomputer. Like they are hosted on multiple servers and scaled independently based on demand. And so around 2020 is when this thing called the Rollup centric roadmap, or the more modular sort of blockchain constructions began to emerge. And that was the time actually when we began Avail, because we understood that the world of blockchains was changing from a more monolithic sort of an architecture to more modular, multi-chain, multi-server sort of a configuration. And similar to how apps on the internet have evolved in a certain way with servers, distributed servers, we think the world of blockchain is also going to follow in those footsteps. So of course, Ethereum was the first to go in that direction. But in general, Ethereum, as we know, began in this at a time when building blockchains monolithically was the way, and so they've had to kind of do a lot of changes mid-flight, so as to speak, right? So that's why to support this more multi-chain interoperable sort of a future, it'll take a lot of time for Ethereum to build all this out, and developers are not going to wait around. And so we thought we should be building the infrastructure that is required to support this more modular, more roll-up centric, more interoperable sort of future. And so at Avail, really, we build infrastructure that scales and support helps in interoperability of this roll-up or the modular blockchains in general.
And for people that are unfamiliar with like what it takes to like what modular blockchains require as opposed to monolithic, is it you guys are building data availability layers? Talk to them a little bit about like the kind of components and infrastructure you guys are building and like why that's necessary.
See, in general, like if you kind of break it down into blockchain into a few pieces, right? Like what you really need is things like in a blockchain you require three key things. One is essentially um, like ordering or consensus of transactions in general, which is like you can the most popular term within the industry for that is like broadly categorized as data availability. Then there is an execution element, then there is a finality element, and so on. And so we, apart from execution, we kind of try to provide everything else in general. So we work with execution teams like Arbitrum, Optimism, Polygon, Starkware, zkSync, Stacker, Scroll, Sovereign, and many others to kind of create this more scalable, more interoperable sort of a end-to-end product in general. So we focus on data availability, we focus on interoperability. The data availability part of the layer we have been building since 3.5 years, and it went into mainnet a couple of months ago. And the interoperability part, right? Like right now, if you kind of, if people familiar with the blockchain space know, there are now these Ethereum faces this issue of 100 chains and more, leading to a lot of fragmentation, UX fragmentation, and so on. And so part of the reason is because the underlying infra is not built for interoperability. So you have to patch on a solution for that. And so, like we anticipated all this back in 2020. And so we have been building with those things in mind. So eventually, once all of this is fully built out, um, uh, the Avail will be able to support hundreds or thousands of blockchains or rollups on top of it, and which can connect to each other as well.
And then let's talk a little bit about rollups, just in case people don't have this like fundamental understanding. So we've got our layer twos, and they are going to require all of this infrastructure. So talk to me a little bit about like what specifically like layer twos are coming to you guys for. Is it for ordering these transactions so that they can then roll up the other transactions into the layer one blockchain? Like talk to them a little bit about the like functionality and like how people work with you. Like a new layer two comes along and they're like, hey, I want to use
See,
Avail.
essentially, like I said in the beginning of the discussion, is that like how do you kind of scale blockchain technology to like when you want to reach, let's say, millions and billions of users, right? Like what is the ideal construct? Now you can, like a lot of people kind of take the assumption that if we build a very scalable chain, it will be able to fit all of the world's transactions on it, right? Like so, so essentially that is not going to work, right? Like you really require these server-like constructs. So in the more traditional, like mobile app space, web app space, and so on, you use servers, right? Like if your application is small, you use a virtual machine, for example, or a virtual server. Or if your app grows big, you use a dedicated server. If your app grows very big, you have like a lot of servers. Like Facebook runs on like millions of servers. Instagram works on millions of servers, right? Like so, as demand increases, you increase the number of servers that can cater to the demand, right? So rollups in that definition really is like how can we take this notion of blockchains to match this more distributed server sort of a paradigm in general. And the word rollup, that is where it comes from, is that instead of doing all transactions on the base layer, we kind of create these constructs called roll-ups. The name roll-up really means is like it's a verifiable server, and it rolls up to the base layer, to the layer one blockchain, right? Like so, so it's essentially, you can think of this as like if there's like a big app like Instagram or Facebook on let's say blockchain technology, then like they will constantly need to keep adding servers to for like to meet demand, right? Like so, how how does that, right? Like, so most apps will start off as, like, let's say, an application on on one of these roll-up chains. They will eventually move to being their own roll-up, or like application specific roll-up. Or and in time, when demand increases, they will just add more roll-up servers to meet more demand. And essentially, I mean, that's the mental model to look at, right? Like the server, if readers are familiar with that terminology, the server analogy is the best in the sense that a rollup is really a verifiable server, and you can keep adding servers as demand increases. And all of these are coordinated by the Avail base layer in general, right? Like it offers this ordering of transactions, but also offers verification, interoperability, and so on.
Got it. And let's talk a little bit about the unique selling points, because I know there are other like data availability solutions. There are other people providing like infrastructure to rollups. Talk to us a little bit about like what sets Avail apart.
Yeah, in general, see, as I've been kind of discussing before in this, right? Like, so if you want to kind of get blockchains into this new modular sort of a construction where you can kind of have these servers added on demand, like roll-up servers added on demand, data availability, providing data availability alone is just one part of the solution. It's also like how do, if you add multiple servers or roll-up servers, how do these connect to each other? How do these talk to each other? For example, how do users not have a very fragmented user experience? For example, how do developers, like, I'll give you an example for like Aave, for example, uh, is one protocol, but it's deployed on like 12 chains today. Uh, and why is that? Because Aave doesn't want to lose users from these 12 chains, right? Like, I mean, the code is the same, the protocol is the same, but they have to deploy on these multiple chains. And why? Because there is there is no interoperability between the chains that they operate. And so even developers have to kind of uh, deploy on these and maintain these deployments on multiple chains, just to kind of support these users. I mean, the ideal end goal should be that a protocol or a project deploys on one chain, and users across chains are able to access the functionality, for example. So there are various issues with like going into this multi-chain sort of a future. So it's not only, so data availability is one part of the solution. Avail, of course, offers the state-of-the-art solution. It's the only project that implements data availability sampling with validity proofs. Like no other project has implemented that in general. But even then, that is not enough. You also have to provide solutions for interoperability. You have to provide solutions for UX fragmentation and so on. And so essentially, I think Avail is the only project that is kind of looking at that kind of end-to-end solution compared to other competitors.
Got it. And let's talk a little bit about the developer experience. Let's say, I have some new L2 that I'm spinning up called Jax Chain, and I'm interested in working with Avail. Talk to me a little bit about how it works from the developer standpoint. Is it I integrate some kind of SDK? Talk to him a little bit about how that works.
Yeah, so we've see for this particular use case, I mean, we've already kind of gone ahead and built out integrations with major rollup stacks. So, like, let's say Arbitrum, Optimism, Polygon, zkSync, Starkware, Stacker, Sovereign. We are starting one with Scroll, for example. So, I mean, we've already done a bunch of integrations already. So, if you're using one of these stacks, I mean, essentially, you don't have to do too much work. Just go ahead and deploy, like, and configure it properly, and then you can run your own chain. In general, like, of course, there are these more general purpose chains like the EVM chains and Starkware and such. There's also like Stacker, for example, which is the more application specific rollup stack, where like you can create your own application specific rollup, which is a very very different from like a EVM rollup, for example, in the sense that you can actually take like what you would have generally put in a smart contract on an EVM, you can actually build it as part of this application specific rollup. And so we've been waiting for that developer tooling on that specific stack to get developed more, but we are already seeing a lot of early traction in that sense. And so, in general, you can actually code in things like TypeScript, JavaScript, even Python, for example, in some of this, which also lowers the developer friction a lot. In general, like you can get more and more Web2 developers developing on these tools, for example. So, but yeah, I mean, in answer to your question, like really, we've like in that sense, like you don't really need to tinker too much with the Avail stack. It just literally works mostly out of the box.
Got it. Got it. So let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges you guys have faced, either from a business or development perspective. Do you feel like it's the biggest challenge is really creating the product and like the technical difficulties, or is it partnerships, business development, marketing, things of that nature?
See, essentially, we've been like doing this for a long time. I mean, I've done this at Polygon since 2017, and like with Avail since we started in 2020, for example. I think like navigating the industry itself is not it's like relatively not that hard in general. The thing is that the entire industry is focusing on solutions that like in general, like we build this kind of a lot of infra, and it's sort of like a closed ecosystem in a sense that we expect users to kind of onboard and on ramp and come to blockchains, for example, and then use applications and so on. So there's a lot of user friction to like for users to come and use these blockchains. In general, like the challenge is not like things like like how do we get more business partnerships and so on. So that's something we are pretty used to. In general, the challenge is how can we expand the pie? Like how can we kind of take this incredible blockchain technology that we have built and put it into a place where there is already the use distribution is there, or users are there. Like rather than expecting users to come to where blockchains are, how can we kind of modularize this technology and put it in put it into places where the users already are, the distribution already is. Like I'm just like to give examples, right? Like I mean, like a lot of people are kind of excited about ton Telegram open network, for example. And one reason is because like for a change, instead of building a blockchain and expecting users to create organic distribution, where what you're doing is you already have like a channel which has a lot of users, and you're taking the blockchain technology to that user base, for example. Something that like Libra, for example, that was conceptualized by Facebook, like was an early attempt at that, in the sense that Facebook already has this user base. Can we kind of take the technology there? And so the real challenge is not in navigating the current state of the industry. The real challenges are in terms of how do we grow the pie, how do we grow new audiences, get to new audiences, get to new users, get to new use cases, take the blockchain technology to where the users are rather than the inverse.
Yeah, we on the podcast have been quite interested in the Ton ecosystem because I was always very firm in that. Like my mom never goes to a website and it's like, oh, they're using MongoDB, or like, oh wow, they're using AWS Cloud Functions. She just like it works, and that's all she cares about, and she doesn't care if there's a blockchain under the hood. So it's just building better solutions. After seeing the death of the Libra project and then seeing the success of the Ton project on Telegram, do you see a world in which Web2 companies start to integrate blockchains into their system? Like I could see X, or do you think the regulatory pressure is just too high? Like where do you kind of see the future unfolding here?
See, I mean, so I think, see, I see broadly, like this is of course my personal opinion, but essentially there are broadly two ways which I see this technology being used. One is the more, like permissionless, censorship resistant sort of an applications that are there. Like so that will be one area where the industry continues to iterate on. The second, which we are seeing more and more, is like enterprises getting into public blockchains, for example, but doing more permission flows, for example, like so like companies like big companies like like BlackRock, for example, etc. are kind of coming onto public blockchains, but they're doing these more regulated, more compliant sort of flows, like like KYC, AML, sanction monitoring, so on and so forth, right? Like so, because to be very honest, public blockchain rails are actually superior tech compared to like conventional ledger technologies, like compared to like ledgers used in banking, used in other financial services functions, right? Like so, this is pretty much state of the art in terms of ledger technology, in terms of like a lot of other resilience and a lot of other things in general. And so the reason for someone like a BlackRock coming in is that things like settlement are pretty instant, for example, and so on. So there are a lot of properties of the blockchain that a lot of enterprises and like even regulators and governments really like. But like there it's a nuanced question, right? Like I mean there is like this whole there is all this money crypto element, and there's a tech crypto element, then there is a permissionless censorship resistant element, and then there's a more permissioned regulated compliant flow element. And so sometimes there is a dichotomy in the sense that like do you want to use blockchains for this or that. But I think as we have seen in the market doing, is that there is like there is a space for both. And so more and more we are seeing more and more interest from Web2 companies, financial services companies, a lot of other companies exploring this, but in a more regulated, compliant sort of permission sort of manner.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, it seems like there are many things under the, like, we could call it the crypto umbrella, where you mentioned like censorship resistance, you have better ledgers, all, even the monetary aspect of like token creation. So these larger, maybe Web2 companies, more traditional companies, may just pick and choose which of those specific features actually fits their use case, which is to be expected. It makes sense to me. So with that in mind, how do you see like Avail contributing to the broader adoption of Web3 technologies? Is it that you guys are providing this stack that makes it really easier to create modular, blockchains plus interoperability?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, yeah, the base components are certainly, like, how can we provide more scalable and interoperable infra for sure in general. And of course, Avail is by definition a permissionless sort of platform, so you could build all sort of use cases. But because of my personal background before Polygon in fintech, regulatory tech, like I also have a strong interest on the things like on the fintech or financial services side. How do we get more and more companies using like let's say tokenization techniques, like asset tokenization, that sort of things. And tokenization itself is not a it's not necessarily financial. Like tokenization is a very broad term in the Web2 industry in general, right? Like so I mean uh, so identity is able to be tokenized. For example, personal data like your digital footprint data can be tokenized. For example, assets can of course can be tokenized. Like things like loyalty cards, airline points. Like there's a bunch of use cases around tokenization and asset tokenization. And I think certainly we will offer these more permissionless rails. But I think more in recent days and months, we've been focusing on how do we grow the industry, like as much as we can.
Absolutely. And finally, like, can we start talking about some of, because you mentioned partnerships earlier, talk to us a little bit about like things that the community can kind of look forward to from you guys, any kind of future developments, milestones.
Yeah, yeah. So we launched Avail D on mainnet a couple of months ago, but and we have been now heads down developing, like the interop element, which is the Nexus piece, the Avail Nexus piece, which will like heavy development is going on. So we kind of anticipate prototype coming out soon. We've been also been busy signing up chains that will launch on Avail, for example. So we have like a big announcement coming next week in Token 2049, and of course, like a bunch of other chains that are set to roll out on Avail in the coming months, for example. So yeah, all in all, like incredible progress on the interoperability, rollup interoperability piece, for example, that we will be announcing more details on, and more chains, uh, including some very big ones coming soon.
Amazing. So finally, where can people learn more about Avail? Where can they keep in touch with you personally? Shout out any kind of social media, any kind of websites?
Yeah. So people can learn more about Avail at www.avail.project.org. Either Twitter handle is also Avail Project. My personal handle on Twitter is Anurag Arjun, ANURAG ARJUN. And feel free to DM me if you have any questions. And I try to answer most DMs.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Everyone go get involved with Avail, go get involved with everything the company is doing. We're very excited to see what they accomplish. So to all the listeners, let's get back to building the future of Web3.